Good evening, and thank you for joining us on this special Facebook Live on an investigation that I, Lilia Luciano, have been working on almost since I got here to Sacramento. The topic is crisis or issues or secrets of family court. And joining me tonight are Jacqueline Kira and Catherine Campbell from the California Protective Parents Association. So I first want to introduce what it is that we're going to be talking about, because I know that there are many of the communities that are already engaged and aware of the issues that parents face when they go to family court throughout divorce, and especially when there's issues of custody. And so I know some people are already going on Facebook, that they've been following this topic, but for anybody who's new, what we're going to talk about tonight is about what happens when there is what is called a highly contentious divorce, mainly when there's some kind of allegation of abuse and you take this divorce, this custody battle to family court. Some of the numbers that I've encountered have been alarming. And so I want to start tonight, Catherine, asking you, because we've been talking for a long time about this issue, about one of the first misconceptions that I think exists when it comes to dealing with custody, when it comes to dealing with divorce, and especially going through family court, is most children end up in the custody of mothers. And if a mother loses custody of her children, something must be really wrong with her. She must be abusive or mentally unfit, incapable of taking care of this child. So first of all, if you can tell me, what is the California Association of Protective Parents, or Protective Parents Association, and how do you debunk, I guess, this conception?
Right. Well, we are an organization that started 19 years ago when there was a case that had multiple CPS cases open against for this child who was being abused by an abusive parent, and it was dismissed. The abusive parent ended up with custody of this child, and the mother in this case, who was the protective parent, ended up dying of breast cancer. It was quite sad, and there was so much evidence that an organization needed to be started to say, what is happening in family court? Why is this something so obvious not being looked at, and why is abuse being dismissed?
Right. So when we talk about a protective parent, we're talking about the alternative to the abusive parent. We're talking about the parent who's protecting a child from abuse.
That's exactly right. We're against abusive parents, which most people are against abuse.
Right.
So
I mean, everybody is against abuse. Everybody's against abusive parents. We would imagine that the courts are there to protect children from abuse, as is the police, as is CPS. So where is the issue?
A complete disconnect. Just like you said, you assume that a protective parent would be able to protect a child, and I think that's the assumption of most people when they realize their child's being abused. The first thing they want to do is move away from that relationship, protect the child.
Right.
So they move away and they move into divorce court. And when you go to divorce court, you do believe that you will be able to show up, say what's happened, and everyone will believe you.
Right.
What happens a lot of time is the abusers tend to have more money, and it becomes a money issue where they are the ones who end up with a lawyer. If you do not have money for a lawyer, there is not one given to you in family court.
So this is one of the issues that was surprising to me. So let's talk about what the difference is between family court and criminal court, for instance. I mean, family court exists on the basis that it's kind of like a civil court where you're not entitled to have a public defender. You don't have an attorney if you can't afford one. So what happens in those cases, Jacqueline, if you can tell me? I mean, going through that process, what does that look like for somebody who, as yourself, doesn't have an attorney and is representing themselves in court, without getting too specific?
Well, it's a terrifying and incredibly overwhelming process. You just imagine that you'll be heard, and a lot of times if you don't have an attorney, your voice isn't heard. You don't know the laws, you don't know the procedures, and what ends up happening is you get railroaded. In criminal court, let's say you're being faced with a crime, you have a right to an attorney, you have a right to know what crime you've committed, and the consequence is, prison or something to that matter. In family court, you do not have the right to an attorney. Oftentimes, you do not have a right to know what you've been accused of, and the consequence is losing all custody of your children.
That's really high stakes, which is what was, to me, coming into this issue, I've met so many parents who say The moment I stepped into family court, I thought it was going to be simple. I had all of this evidence, CPS, police records, arrest records of the other person, the other parent has some kind of allegations of abuse, and the judge, or who is the sole authority, the one who decides where your children go, the one who decides on those high stakes, is supposed to take that information, make a decision, and hopefully protect the children. So where does this not happen? Why aren't judges, or are judges, taking in evidence? What are the issues that you're seeing when it comes to allegations of abuse in a courtroom? We're
seeing a lot of evidence is being dismissed. What happens is when there's many allegations, the couple comes in to protect a child or to protect their innocence, depending on if they're the abusive parent or the protective parent. And the judge will not have enough time to look at this, so they request that they order an evaluation. Most of the time, a protective parent is unable to pay for this. They start out about $10,000 and go up to $40,000 for an evaluation of your family.
So when you say $10,000, and I want to take advantage of these numbers and of this moment, because if anybody who's watching has gone through this issue and this problem, if you have gone through family court, I urge you to go online, go on to, to go and comment onto our comments in this link and tell us your story and ask your questions, because I'm going to continue on this topic. So when you say $10,000 for an expert,
$10,000 for an evaluation to come in, and usually it's the abusive parent who ends up paying.
So if one of the parties pays for the expert, anybody would conclude that evaluation would be biased.
Yes.
Could be biased.
They say that they're not being biased.
They just say that.
They say that, but they are being paid by one parent.
Okay, so let's go back a little bit. We're talking about family court issues, secrets in family court. One of the problems when it comes to family court and custody disputes is that many of the documents, these evaluations that you're talking about, are secret. They're concealed. They are not disclosed in order to protect the privacy of children. What ends up happening is that nobody knows this is going on. It's a complex matter. A lot of journalists who I talk to are like, "You're crazy for going into that. It's so complicated. It's so full of rage and emotion." And I'm thinking, well, the stakes are really high. Tell me about those stakes.
Well, the stakes are that your children are being abused, and you walk into court. Most people who are the protective parent will spend 100% of what they have to protect their child. Most people lose most of their money. 27% of the protective parents actually go bankrupt. The average cost of going to court to protect your child in these situations is $100,000 for the protective parent alone. Wow. And that is based on how much you have. I don't like to say the average is $100,000. I like to say the average is 100%. And because that's what you're going to pay to protect your children.
Because you have to disclose all of your assets, both parties do.
The first thing you do when you get a lawyer is you turn in all your assets, and they know how much money you have. This is a $50 billion industry, and this is not a cottage industry anymore. You can't say cottage when you say $50 billion. It has turned into, there's experts that come in who are more than happy to come in and help your family through the process. Special masters, co-parent counselors for each children, and of course the evaluators.
And all of these people who get involved, so attorneys for either or both parents, attorneys for the children, custody evaluators, psychologists. When it comes later on to once it's decided that one of the parents is placed under supervised visitation, they have to pay for that, one of the parents.
That's right.
there is a lot of money in the system, and there's very little oversight. I'm reading here from Michelle, who says, family courts don't care about children. They are uneducated about abusers, and there's no jury. That's another crucial part. The reason why there's no oversight, there's no jury. You're not entitled to a public defender. A judge has the sole exclusive authority to decide what's going to happen with your children based on sometimes what one expert will say? Can you tell me about what you guys see when you guide and talk to parents? What are the common, I guess, patterns that concern you, and what the California Protective Parents Association works with them?
Well, one of the number one things that is common in all of these cases where it goes awry is that there's a liar involved, at least one. So we're signing all of these. You sign the court documents under penalty of perjury.
Right.
No one prosecutes for perjury, hardly at all, within the state of California or across the nation. And people in the courts know this, so it's very easy. Let's say you have more money, you're walking into the court, and you hire a custody evaluator, and they make up a fraudulent report about you, and then you lose your children. Who's going to come in and hold that person accountable? The answer is you can file an appeal with the Court of Appeal, which is going to run you about $50,000. Then they say, we don't reassess facts and evidence, sorry. You file a claim with the Commission for Judicial Performance. The statistics of the number of complaints that they review is very low. So there's really not any accountability. If you take this to your police department, they're going to laugh you out of the station, right?
So you mentioned the Commission on Judicial Performance. That's the body that's supposed to be overseeing what happens in court in general. You know, judges' behavior, all of it. As I understand it, the California auditor, Elaine Howell, just tried to submit and to do an audit of the Commission on Judicial Performance to see what it is that they're doing, how are they reprimanding judges, if there is any kind of consequence to bias, to corruption, to the way that judges are acting. The Commission on Judicial Performance comes out and says no, and so they're suing the auditor. Am I correct?
They're suing the auditor to say
to avoid this audit.
To avoid the audit, it's been over a year since the audit was approved.
So that's how little transparency there is in courts in general.
They're being audited and saying the documents are confidential.
Right.
And so we can't have you look at them, even though the auditor has always looked at confidential information and has never in their entire history had an issue with confidentiality. And this is the first time that the Commission for Judicial Performance has been requested to be audited in all of their 57 years.
57 years. So in 60 years, this body has never been audited. The one time that the California auditor decides, okay, we're going to do an audit just to make sure that you're doing your job, that you're holding judges accountable, they said no because our records are confidential. And so therefore, there's really no oversight on what happens in court, much less in family court, because there's no jury. And sometimes people are there representing themselves because they can't afford an attorney. There is experts that make decisions on where your children are going to be. And when, unfortunately, there is a case where there is abuse, sometimes the evidence is not looked at. It's dismissed. And who's going to hold that judge accountable?
Well, no one is. Right. 10% of the cases are looked at. 90% get a form letter that said that the case could not be looked at, their complaint, when you submit something. And of those 10%, only 1% are actually looked at, and they come to an agreement that there was a problem.
What kind of oversight is that?
There is really, it comes to about 0%.
So Diane says, what a joke. If you have money, you can have a baby that is an adopted baby. Other than that, I worked with women and children's services for 27 years. It's so deceitful. And I think, you know, one of the things, somebody mentioned the word parental alienation. So let's get into that. Let's get into the term parental alienation. I've heard this term in two different ways. One way that I've learned about parental alienation is something that people say has been done to them. So, you know, one parent says, my child was alienated from me by the other parent, namely, it was, you know, their minds were poisoned against me, or they were taken away from me, or they were abducted from me. And so those parents go to family court and they claim this alienation. The other way that I've learned about alienation is a court, a judge, or an expert, or a custody evaluator says that parent has been alienating this child, and so they accuse a parent of alienation, and they interpret that alienation as a form of abuse, and therefore remove the custody or remove that child from that parent. So this is one of the issues that we've been discussing a lot lately, which is, okay, so parental alienation. Let's talk about when a parent is accused of parental alienation in court, what happens? They end up losing their children.
Very often. Very often they lose their children. It's a way to deflect from the abuse. So they come up with an excuse. Oh, they're delusional. They turned the children against me. They created this. It never happened. They made the children believe
coached
this.
the children to say they were abused.
Yes, yes. Most children actually who are abused, it's no surprise that they actually prefer not to be with their abuser. This is very common, and Richard Gardner came up with this term, and it's definitely been debunked. There is no science behind it. It's not in the DSM.
Yet how prominent is it in family court?
It's been used and accepted for years.
As a condition? As a psychological condition, as a form of abuse? How do they use it in family court?
They use it as a form of abuse, is what they like to say. And it's now they're realizing, okay, maybe we shouldn't be using it. And they shouldn't be using it, especially in California. They're not allowed to use it, but they still do. There are many people who will still use it. And now they know, oh, I can't use that term. I'm going to use something else.
Coaching.
Well, coaching, or she's delusional. It's a modern day witch hunt.
So, you know, I think we're seeing in our society lately this whole #MeToo campaign, which has been so positive, I think, to especially empower victims of abuse, you know, women or men. I mean, I've had men come to me after I published a video talking about an experience I had who said, you know, this happened to me and I'm coming out and talking about it. And so, you know, abuse is something that in our society is definitely not talked about enough. It's not, people try to avoid getting into it. It's muddy, it's murky. And so I want to talk about the reason why you think that in so many cases there is some kind of evidence and still it is decided by a judge around the country and around the world to dismiss that evidence and still place the custody of a child in the hands of an abuser.
We have seen years with the Catholic Church, the Boy Scouts, Penn State. People don't want to believe it. First off, it's easier.
It's too ugly. It's too hard to believe.
It's too ugly, and it's very sad because we're at a place where we'd rather dismiss it because it's too much for us to handle, but we allow the child who's being abused to handle it day in, day out.
Here I'm seeing a comment. Wait, family court's already said that. Yeah, Michelle says, yes, it's so true. Most journalists won't touch it. Children tell adults about abuse, and the abuser ends up with more parenting time or custody. It's insane. This is why I started doing this story, was because of one comment that a parent told me, and then I saw it in a transcript, which was, at some point, a judge says, so I'm going to remove your children from you because I don't believe that your children's claim of sexual abuse are real, or your child's claim of sexual abuse are real, and therefore you were coaching that child. And what you're saying and what your child is saying is a lie. And so the judge says, in this courtroom, we either have a perjurer or a pedophile. And who gets custody? The alleged pedophile. So that's what we're talking about. Sometimes it's so hard to believe. It's not that judges are, you know, that so many judges are so evil that they're going to place children in harm's way, is that they just don't want to believe it.
Well, they don't want to believe it. Plus, also, they many times don't have time to do anything except look at the report from the evaluator, who's been paid by the abuser for the most part. And it's a very easy decision at that point.
So Bob says nobody. I guess contempt charges don't exist. I figure that this is what you were talking about. Like nobody does.
No one does contempt. But yeah, you know, just to encourage everyone, we did just do a training in Napa. It may have been the first in the country, where District Attorney Don Anderson out of Lake County did a training for other district attorneys to teach them how and to encourage them to prosecute for perjury, and specifically in family law cases. And there's a lot of district attorneys from all over the state that have been calling that are interested in doing that. So I think they're seeing that, yes, this is a problem where the family courts have run rampant, and they just don't really know how to get their hands around it yet.
I think people know it goes on so much, and people are being complicit. And if you compare it to what's been happening in Hollywood, it's just accepted, and it just
silence makes you complicit. Absolutely. So Shannon says, then you have people who will make false allegations just to get custody and get a ridiculous amount of child support. So let's talk about the money. One of the reasons why I've heard or I've come to understand that, say, somebody who had no custody of their children, no interest in custody, suddenly, or no interest in spending time with their children, which is, what I've been looking into several cases for some time, suddenly wants 100% custody. Or historically, this trend started happening more and more. Why is that? I mean, what is it that determines, or rather, let's talk about where the money goes. What's the issue that you consider exists when it comes to custody and fighting over custody?
It's about control. It's about controlling someone, coercive control, domestic violence by proxy, how to control someone else. It's not
so I take your children to further torture you.
To torture you, and oh, you want to take the children, I'm going to make sure you never have the children, you want to have more money. Well, if I take the children 50% of the time, I don't have to pay you as much.
Or if I take the children 100% of the time. So some of what I've been, from what I've heard from some parents is, well, the mother wants 100% custody. The mother is accusing me of, or is accusing a father of abuse because if she gets full custody, she gets more money. Is that true?
If you have more custody, you would probably get more child support. But you have to realize that when children disclose, only 2 to 6% are actually false allegations.
Out of 100% of allegations of abuse,
right, so you have
2 to 6%.
over 90% are true, and we only have 10% of those who come forward with abuse are protected. Wow. So it's really just opposite of what it should be at this point.
So people tend to think that allegations of abuse are mostly false. The child made it up or was coached, when in reality the percentage of false allegations is
that's right.
Less than 10%.
And we have 58,000 children a year being taken away from a protective parent and forced to live either part-time or full-time with the abusive parent.
We're also in California where they look at the friendlier parent as the one that is more likely to be awarded custody. So in abuse cases, this is definitely a problem because you have the protective parent going into court saying, I want my child protected. They should not be around this person. They've been abusive. And the court, it's a trigger for the court to say, oh, you're the unfriendly parent. Oh. This is a high conflict case. We need to now protect that child from you because you are going to disparage the relationship with that other parent.
So let's say, so it's instantly assumed that there's no real abuse. There's just a parent who likes conflict, and therefore the child needs to be protected from that conflictive.
Instead of saying there's a problem, they blame the reporter of abuse, and that becomes then high conflict divorce. And it's not a high conflict. It's just reporting that there's abuse.
So Jocelyn says, if you're in a situation of having no money for a lawyer, how can you protect yourself from losing your child to an abusive parent?
As much documentation as you can is always the best thing you can do. As many witnesses as to keep a thorough documentation, and reporting it to the police right away is very important. A lot of times what happens is when there's these abuse situations, that parent will protect the abuser for a certain amount of time thinking, oh, it's going to turn around. They want to keep the family intact, and then they don't report it. And then when
that's the biggest issue with domestic violence in general.
Right, absolutely. Over
domestic
90%.
Violence, you're already afraid, so it's very likely that you're not going to report it. It's because if they don't pay attention, then you're going to end up worse.
Well, you're threatened not to tell. And sadly, in California, what happens to many parents, protective parents walk into a lawyer's office saying, this is happening to my child, they're being abused. What do I do? And the lawyer will sit there, look you right in the face, and say, don't say anything about the abuse. In California, if you report abuse during a divorce, you have an 85% chance of losing custody.
85%? How do they come up? How do they
85%.
come into this number? That's
it's shocking to know, and it's in the rest of the United States 60 to 70.
So
but
can you repeat? I want to make sure that people hear this again. You're saying that in California, when you're going through a divorce, if you talk about abuse, you are super likely to lose your children?
Yes, so they actually tell you not to bring it up. So you have to decide.
So this comes from that notion of crazy people make up abuse stories to harm the other person.
Right.
And then it's
as opposed to upper hand in custody cases.
Abuse.
Right.
Okay. Right. And you also, it's a catch-22.
Yeah.
Right.
So catch-22 because
how are you going to protect your children otherwise? So I think,
if you don't actually report,
So,
if you don't report and someone else finds out, you can lose custody for not protecting your child.
Right. Okay, so Kim says, I saw and heard many times when I worked with Head Start the number of children forced to visit with an abusive parent. They come back with so many more behavioral issues following a visit. And this is something that I've been trying to understand. How is a child forced to spend time with somebody who's hurt them?
It's very normal. That's happening all over the place, and people have no idea. The courts in general in California and all over are just looking at saying we need to reunify these parents when there's been abuse, and because they're looking at that child, that a child will just want a relationship with their parent, but children want to be protected from an abuser. That's completely normal.
Right. And so the harm that's done to these children, it goes on for life.
Yeah.
It goes on for life. And that's when the ACE study comes into play. What we know what happens to children who have adverse childhood experiences are having early deaths, 20 years off your life if you have 4 or more. Suicide rates go up, drug use, addictions.
And I want to, Chris says, I can't even speak for my son since half the time, I guess he means since he has his son half of the time, the court makes the man looks bad no matter what. I work so that we can live tax-free while her family is rich, and now it's updating because I'm getting so many comments. Great, thank you so much for commenting. We're excited about continuing this conversation. He says, at the end of the day, I pay for her unemployment. Basically, what Chris is talking about is men versus women, the idea that courts favor mothers or, and discredit fathers. What's the scenario right now? What is it that you're seeing? And of course, we have to clarify that the cases that you're working with, the cases that you're dealing with, are cases where there's some kind of allegation or where it's been spoken about domestic violence or child abuse, of course. So it's not like you're talking to everybody.
Right.
We can draw from your experience and the people that you advise, I guess, a general number of all abuse or of all divorce cases. But in the cases that you deal with, is it such a thing as mothers win, fathers lose, fathers win, mothers lose, or is it genderless?
I think the children lose. Is what happens. And when you have someone who doesn't want to put their children's best interest first, it hurts everyone in the family. This is not about who's paying or who's helping. It's about taking care of your child. We don't have enough people who are healthy enough to really sit back and say what's best for my child. And the court, it's supposed to be best interest of the child. It's not happening.
Cassandra says, my son proved in court, fact-based, that perjury was committed by the non-custodial party during a crucial period, and the judge was very aware and simply told my son he needed to move forward. I was mortified hearing the judge's words. It continues. I lived in family court for 14 years, and I hope that this investigative reporting continues. Many of us are advocates for our children, advocates for our children are deemed to have victims' mentality, and protecting our children becomes negative. It's what you were saying. It backfires. Trying to protect your child backfires.
And we can just say, since they brought up about the men and women, I think that we need to let people know that great mothers lose their children all the time in family courts. And they lose it by seeking to protect their child. That's what happens. If that mother will not let go of the abuse, that even when there's documented proof, that she can lose all custody. And that's something a lot of people don't understand.
And talked to men too who have lost custody and have shown evidence, and their children were forced to spend time with the mother who was abusive.
Right. Yeah. We are for any protective parent.
Right. Well, I want to tell everybody watching, and this, like it, share it. Let's continue this conversation. I'm seeing so many comments from so many people. This investigation is only starting. I've been talking to so many parents for the past year or so, and documenting everything that's that they bring forward, talking to all parties involved, and trying to understand and make sense of what is the problem. Why is there a child who has continued to suffer through abuse? Why is there a child who's ended up dead, despite there having been allegations in the past of abuse? So please keep the conversation going. Let's continue talking about this and share your stories. If you're in our area in Sacramento, if you're in the Bay Area too, let's keep this communication, and we'll keep it up.
Thank you,
keep talking
Lilia.
about this.
Thank you, Lilia.
For sure.
Yeah.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you.